Hey guys, Will here. So we're going to be doing something a little bit different today. We're going to be taking a look at the brand new LG UltraGear 45-inch OLED 240Hz gaming display. Now this particular display has been gaining quite a bit of attention, particularly in the sim racing space just of late, because on paper at least it ticks a lot of the boxes for what people would list if they were coming up with their ideal monitor for sim racing. So what we're going to be doing today is putting this monitor through its paces across a variety of different titles, from first-person shooters all the way through to sim racing, and seeing whether this monitor is as good in the real world as it looks like it is on paper. So let's jump in. Okay, so before we get started here, just to give you the full picture of exactly what's going on, big thank you to LG for sending across this monitor for us to check out today. Now, as is always the case here at Boosted Media, nobody has any sort of editorial control over anything we say. So everything that we're going to be sharing today is purely just our own observations, our own thoughts, and our own experiences with this monitor. And they don't get to see the video before you guys do, although they did ask, I did say no. Now, at the time of filming this video, availability is a little bit scarce with these screens, but if we do have any affiliate links available, we'll chuck them in the description down below. Those are an awesome way for you guys to help support the channel at no additional cost to you, should you wish to do so. But there's obviously no obligation to do that. It's just a thing that you can do if you want to help support our work here. But that is everything we need to cover in terms of a precursor to the review. So let's dive in and check this monitor out. So let's start off here by talking about prices. So if you're in the US, you're looking at $1,699.99. If you're in Australia, that equates to 2,999 Australian dollars. So it certainly isn't a cheap monitor. It does have very, very high-end specifications though, which we'll unpack now. And yeah, we'll determine throughout this video whether the value for money is going to be there for your particular usage case. So we're starting off with the, let's start off by talking about the resolution. So we're looking at a resolution of 3,440 by 1440 pixels. So it's an aspect ratio of 21:9, or a WQHD display. And one of the things that trips people up a lot, particularly when they're choosing monitors for sim racing specifically, is a lot of people go for a ultra wide monitor that's quite narrow, and you end up just not having an overall good perspective of the world around you. You get a really narrow kind of field of view vertically. So by my measurements, this display has a vertical display area of 440 millimeters, or 17¼ inches. And horizontally, measuring from the corner to the corner, so not accounting for the curve, which we'll talk about in just a moment, the dimensions are 980 millimeters, or 38½ inches. So it does give you a good amount of vertical real estate, as well as obviously the horizontal. And that's definitely a big improvement over the 35-inch ultra-wide displays, which I ran previously as triple screens on my sim rig. Those were very narrow, and I did really notice that when I jumped in and drove for the first time. It wasn't something that I kind of thought about ahead of time, but it definitely is something that you're going to want to consider. Now, another thing that's been attracting a lot of attention about this particular monitor is the very, very aggressive curve radius. So we've got a curve radius here of 800 R, which means the optimum viewing distance for this display is 800 millimeters. So what that means in a practical sense is that if you're sitting 800 millimeters away from the display, then the physical distance between the area that you're looking at on the display and your head or your eyes is going to be the same distance every time. Now that has a couple of practical advantages. Not only does it make it a little bit more immersive, because it kind of pulls you into the content rather than feeling like you're looking at a two-dimensional screen. Although it isn't 3D, of course, there's an important distinction there between something which actually has, you know, stereoscopic 3D versus something that just kind of pulls you in to a two-dimensional space. So it's important to make that distinction. But the other advantage as well is it gives you more uniform color reproduction and luminance. I'm sure a lot of you guys that have seen some older technology displays, depending on your viewing angle of the display, and even just here when I'm sitting here looking at this display off center, I can see the display looks more blue over this side and more warm sort of towards the middle, and that's just due to the viewing angle of the display. So when you have the exact same viewing angle across the entire surface, it does give you that really accurate and uniform reproduction of color and luminance. Now, one of the issues that I've had when I've tested out curved displays in the past is the reflections that you get on the screen. So I'm going to switch across into a darker scene now for you guys, just so we can have a little look here. Now, obviously there's a lot of studio lights and things going on in here at the moment, so it's a bit of an extreme example. But when you have a curved display, rather than it just picking up reflections from the things that are directly behind you, it kind of works a bit like a parabolic antenna. So what it's doing is it's picking up light from all sorts of different directions around you and kind of converging them all at your eyes. So you do end up getting a lot more weird reflections going on curved displays in general. That's just as a general observation from my usage on a couple of different screens over the last sort of 5 or 6 years that I've been using them. So what they've done on this particular display, and I think it actually works really well, is they've given it an anti-reflective coating, and it's kind of got a bit of a matte finish here. Now, oftentimes with matte displays, if you've ever used a matte display or a non-reflective screen protector on your smartphone, you've seen it kind of can take an edge off the display quality. It kind of just distorts the edges of the pixels a little bit. Now, if you get really up close on this, you can see it does make the edges of the pixels a little bit furry, but at the normal sort of viewing distance of 800 millimeters or more with this display, it really isn't an issue at all, and it actually works really well. You can see that you will get a general sense of bright light sources around you, and I can see that right now. So for example, I've got a studio light sitting directly in front of me, and as I move around on the screen, I kind of see it jumping from left to right. So any direct sources of light will of course show up, but what I can't see is any reflections of any objects on the table. So these white sheets of paper that I've got on the desk, for example, I can't see those at all. Literally all I can see reflected is just the studio lights that we've got dotted around in here. And when I've been using this monitor in a more practical kind of setting in my office, playing games and doing work and editing, things like that, it hasn't really been an issue with reflections at all, which is something that I have really appreciated on this particular screen over some of the displays that I've tested in the past. So I thought that was definitely worth calling out. So that brings us now to talking about OLED, or organic light emitting diode. Now, what this technology does is it allows each individual pixel to emit its own light. And this is the first OLED display that I've ever actually used on my PC day to day. I've had a couple of laptops that had it, but in terms of a larger format display, using it to play games, using it to edit videos, just do general office work, it's the first experience that I've had with an organic LED display. And I've got to say that it has absolutely blown me out of the water in terms of just the clarity that you get with the picture. Now, the main thing to understand with organic LED is that, as I was saying, each individual pixel actually emits its own light. So they quote an almost infinite contrast ratio of 1,500,000 to 1. Now, I know that kind of doesn't mean much in the real world, but I can tell you, compared to my daily driver sim rig, which is an LCD panel with a backlight array, it makes a massive difference. So there's a couple of different types of panels that you can buy now, and I thought it's worth kind of talking about the differences here, just so you understand the technology behind. So you've got your typical cheaper LCD displays, which are generally edge backlit. And what that will generally mean is you've got a strip around the border of the screen, sometimes only the top and one side. And that basically illuminates the area of the screen that needs to be bright. So you can imagine in this scenario here, where you've got a bright white car in the middle here, you'd have this section of the LED backlight active, and then you'd have this area here active as well. And that's what actually generates the brightness that you're seeing through the screen. So you can imagine the LCD panel itself is not emitting any light itself. It relies on the light shining through from behind it to actually, give you any sort of picture coming out of the display at all. So what would happen in that case if you had just the edge LED is you'd get a bit of a strip across here and a strip down the middle where the blacks weren't really completely black, and you'd actually see it kind of ghosting around the area. So then you have an array backlight display, which is often referred to as an LED LCD display. And what that will generally have is an array of LED lights behind the display itself. So rather than being edge backlit, it's actually able to light up directly behind the area that is needing to be illuminated. But what the disadvantage there is compared to OLED, once again, is that you're still relying on a somewhat vague backlighting array. Obviously, you don't have a backlight for each individual pixel on the display. So what that would mean in a practical sense, once again, is this area here where you've got cars in my mirror, that would be bright, and you get a ghosting around that area of the screen where it was a little bit brighter. It's kind of that gray color rather than being true, complete jet black. So what we can see on the OLED display by comparison, this is really what jumps out to me the most about OLED panels. All the other technology aside, this is really what wows me, is just you can see that perfect edge between really, really bright white there where the headlights are in the background, and then the black right next to it. That really does make the images really pop out and really look extremely lifelike. So in a gaming sense, it really does make any game that you play with an OLED display a lot more immersive than what you get with an LCD, whether it edge or array backlit. But also just in general usage, if I tab back to my main screen here, you can see, if we scroll back up here to the overview of the display, even just areas like this where you're looking at an image, you've got a bright white area right next to a black area. Normally on a LCD display, you'd have this kind of transition between the black and the white. And I mean, they do a pretty good job these days, but nothing that I've seen at least comes anywhere close to that distinction that you get, the contrast ratio you get between a bright white and a black area on a hard edge like this. So it just makes that general usage of the display outside a gaming context a little bit more enjoyable as well. So there's a lot of other little bits and pieces which we'll cover off in our conclusions a little later on, but the next big talking point here, and the last one that I really want to sort of dive into and unpack for you guys, is the refresh rate. Now, I want to get this right word for word here. So LG are claiming world's first 240 Hertz OLED gaming monitor with a 0.03 millisecond gray to gray response time. So there's obviously a lot to unpack there in terms of response time, input lag, things like that, which we'll talk about when we get into this test. But what I wanted to do now is actually put the refresh rate to the test and actually see for myself whether I'm able to perceive any practical advantage from a refresh rate as high as 240 Hertz. So we're going to test it in a first person shooter first, then we'll jump into a sim racing title and see exactly what I can and can't see. Okay, so at the moment the monitor is in 240 Hertz mode, as you can see down here under choose a refresh rate. I mean, you guys won't be able to see it on camera, but the way this is moving around, everything is just so slick and smooth. It's like butter. But if I drop that down to 60, let's start off at 60 Hertz. Nobody's going to be running 50 Hertz, I don't think. So we'll start at 60. And immediately I notice that the mouse looks like it's kind of chopping across the screen. So immediately, just for day-to-day usage, it's jittering across when I move things around, and it just doesn't have that fluid, butter smooth experience. Just generally using the desktop, editing video, doing just your general web browsing, whatever you happen to do on a PC day-to-day outside of gaming. So it's already a better experience in that regard. But let's jump into Cyberpunk now. So what we've got set up here is a basic training room in Cyberpunk. So we're gonna have a bunch of guys popping out that we're gonna have to try and shoot as quickly as we can. Now, what I've done in terms of setup is I've set the monitor, as you guys just saw, to 60 Hertz. I've also capped the frame rate inside the game at 60 Hertz and turned VSync on at 60 Hertz as well. So everything is kind of locked to that 60 Hertz frame rate, so we're not getting any other weird things introducing screen tearing or anything like that. So we're not relying on adaptive refresh rate or anything like that here. Now, just moving and scrolling around here, having played on this monitor at 240 Hertz for the last month and a half or so that I've been testing this out, immediately it feels way less smooth than it did before. Just simple movements like strafing left and right, not so much, but quickly snapping to a position, it feels very jittery just moving around. So let me just go up to the guys. We'll see them pop out. Where are they? There we go, all right. Get these guys. I'm gonna die. I'm not very good at first-person shooters, but you get the idea here. So look, when I'm doing minor movements and just kind of moving around slowly, it's not a massive difference. But when I'm moving around the screen quickly like this, that's when I really notice it. So let's bump it up to 90 Hertz now and see what kind of difference that makes. Okay, so exact same thing again. I said 90 Hertz before. The next step up was actually 100 Hertz. So we're running at 100 Hertz now, jumped up from the 60 that we were running before. Let's head down again. Moving around, I can still see a little bit of jumpiness. It's obviously smoother to my eyes than it was at 60 Hertz, but it is still noticeably different from the 240 Hertz that I was running before. So we'll quickly jump in again. There we go. Whether or not I'm more accurate with my shooting is probably debatable, but definitely moving around. Yeah, I'd say like I'm not noticing a massive game-changing difference just in little small movements like that, but definitely if I'm spinning around the room and doing things like that, it definitely feels a lot more fluid than it did before. So let's jump up to 140 Hertz now. All right, so this is 144 Hertz now. This is the refresh rate that I play at on my triple 65-inch 4K setup normally. So this is probably what I'm most used to. But yeah, I mean, again, very, very smooth moving around. This is noticeably smoother than the 100 Hertz setting. So I would say there's definitely an advantage there. It has that fluid kind of buttery smooth movement moving around here. Strafing, pretty much same as what we had with 100 Hertz, but let's just quickly get the guys to pop up again. Yeah, I think maybe I'm noticing a little bit more fluidity just in the mouse movements in general than I did at 100 Hertz, even maybe a bigger jump from this to 144 than, from 100 to 144 than what I felt from 60 to 100, which actually surprises me. But yeah, definitely felt like that was just the little micro movements were a little bit more snappy and precise. Just felt a little bit more connected to the game than what I did at 100. So it definitely was noticeable there. Let's now jump up to 240 and see whether I notice any difference between that and 144. I don't think I will, but let's see. All right, so 240 hertz now. So, okay. So moving around quickly, it doesn't feel any smoother than it did at 144 for me, but little micro movements like that again do feel a little bit more fluid. And that surprises me. This is genuinely the first time I've done a direct comparison between the two, because I've been running it at 240 the whole time that I've been testing it. But let's quickly get these guys again. I do feel a little bit more connected. It does feel a little bit more responsive and a little bit more snappy. There's not a whole lot in it, but there's definitely something there. Let's just advance a little bit further here.
Tacking's the next item on the menu.
Yeah,
I notice I tweaked the course material a bit.
Moving around, yeah, moving around like this, not a huge difference, but those little micro movements are just so precise, so snappy, and there's like genuinely no perceivable input lag there at all. So let's jump into iRacing now and see what kind of difference that makes in an environment where, you know, you're traveling a long distance between frames. I think that might make a slightly different story to what we have here in a first-person shooter. All right, so we've loaded up iRacing now. As before, everything is locked to 60 hertz, so 60 frames per second, 60 hertz refresh rate on the monitor with VSync. Let's drive out and see how this feels. Now, just for a bit of backstory here while we get out here and warm up the tires a little bit. When I first got more seriously into sim racing, I was running a Samsung TV, which is still the same one that we run now for a lot of our testing. Now, I originally set that up at 4K at 60 hertz, which was the maximum that one is capable of. And I ran it that way for about 6 months, was perfectly happy with it. Everything seemed perfectly smooth, just as this does to me now. And somebody recommended to me after a little while that, after about 6 months or so, that I try running it at 1440p at 120 hertz, which was the maximum it was capable of, rather than the 60 hertz I've been running at 4K. And I kind of thought, well, I want to have that visual clarity, I want to have that visual quality. Why would I want to sacrifice frames when, why would I want to sacrifice visual quality for frames when it looked perfectly smooth anyway? And he said, trust me, just try it. So I did, and honestly, I couldn't go back after that. It genuinely did feel smoother. Now, it's funny because like on paper, you can't pinpoint the difference, but when you're traveling such a large distance between frames as you are in sim racing, any little thing that allows you to better perceive what the car's doing more quickly is an advantage, and particularly with sim racing where you're relying more visually on what's happening on the screen for representation of what the car's doing underneath you, rather than seat of the pants feel, it becomes all that more important. But look, right now, with everything locked at 60 hertz, I can drive this absolutely fine. I don't feel like I'd be any slower than my normal pace at this refresh rate. And what I do, I've been doing this car and track combination on the daily driver sim just last night, running it at about 110 frames per second, because we are frame rate limited on that system being triple 4K. But yeah, I wouldn't say that this feels any more choppy or any less, you know, responsive. But then when I go back to that system and feel the faster frame rate, it does feel different. So let's jump in now. Let's bump this up to 144 frames per second. And let's see if I can perceive any difference between that and the 60 on this particular monitor. And then we'll jump it up to 240 and see whether that's a jump as well. All right, so we're at 144 hertz now, up from 60 hertz. I skipped over around that 100 hertz range because that's where I drive normally. And sort of really wanted to sort of get the feel for the difference, stepping it up an extra 30 or 40 odd hertz from what I'm used to makes here. And it's really difficult to convey because I definitely do feel a difference, but it's really hard to pinpoint exactly what it is. But through the bumpy section of the circuit right here, what I'm noticing is at 60 hertz or even around the 100 hertz range, when the car really starts to get reactive over bumps and jump around, you kind of, it becomes visually noisy, and you lose, it's hard to focus on what you're actually trying to look at. it kind of just all gets lost in the movement. But what I'm finding is at 144 hertz, I'm able to lock my focus more on what I'm trying to pay attention to. It doesn't get lost as much. It's very subtle, but there's something there, and the car just maybe feels that touch more responsive as well. I mean, it's subtle, but I mean, if you're an esports professional, these are the kinds of things that can make a big difference. And again, like we said before, when you're relying on what you're seeing visually to really interpret what the car is doing underneath you rather than the seat of the pants feel, yeah, it definitely is an improvement, even over the 100 hertz that I normally run. So that does actually surprise me because I've never really played more than 120 hertz before in a sim. And I definitely am finding this more fluid, more dynamic, and easier to perceive than what I've experienced before. So let's step it up again now. Let's step it up by a big chunk up to 240 hertz. I honestly don't know what to expect here. I'm trying to sort of relate it back to what we saw in the first person shooter earlier, but I really don't know what this is going to be like. So let's give it a go. All right, so 240 hertz now. I'm really straining myself to try and perceive something. Let's go through the more bumpy section here again. Yeah, there's nothing in it for me. I mean, I was able to catch that slide. I put a wheel on the dirt there, but yeah, I mean, I'm getting on in age. I'm going to be 40 years old next year, believe it or not. But yeah, for me, my eyes, I would have a very, very, very difficult time in a blind test. I don't think I could tell the difference in a blind. There's not even any point in doing a blind test because I wouldn't be able to tell the difference. I can tell you right now, 144 hertz is incredibly smooth for me. This is also incredibly smooth, but yeah, I can't tell the difference here. I could in a first person shooter, no doubt. Absolutely could make out the difference, but for me, 144 hertz, 240 hertz, there's, if anything, such a small difference. I couldn't justify spending the extra money just for that. Okay, so we spent quite a bit of time now unpacking each of the individual things that have stood out to me in the month and a half that we've been using this monitor. But really, I think to convey the experience properly, we need to combine everything together and just talk about what it's like to use overall. Now, when you combine the visual clarity that you get with OLED pixels, the fast response time that you get as well with the lack of ghosting, when you combine all of that with the high refresh rate that we have here as well, the end result is just a visual experience unlike anything that I've ever experienced before in a computer monitor. So just little details like, one thing that really stood out to me in particular with sim racing was when the road is rushing towards you, when you're going really fast down a straight, the detail and the texture of the road seems to be retained. And I guess that's just that's a function of the high refresh rate plus the lack of ghosting like we were talking about. But you can still see that granular detail in the road surface as it rushes towards you. And little things like that are what really kind of pull you in and immerse you in the game at a deeper level. So it might not be the biggest screen that I've ever used. Obviously you guys have seen my, massive 65-inch 4K that I normally race on. But I did find the level of immersion that this provided for me was very, very, very good. And I think it's just those little details, just the contrast ratio as well. The fact that you can have a fully bright white pixel right next to a completely black one. Just the clarity that you get through those little details when you put them all together is absolutely amazing. So yeah, look, for me, I think having experienced this, I probably would buy one for my daily use PC, for gaming, for editing my videos, all those things. I've just really, really enjoyed the monitor. And while I did say that I felt like the 240 hertz refresh rate probably wasn't something that was a selling point for me specifically for sim racing, I did notice a difference with first-person shooters, and I think really that's going to be a very much a subjective thing. So there's going to be a point for everybody where you just get diminishing return when it comes to refresh rate. But again, the point here is when you bring all those things together, it does make for an absolutely fantastic experience. Now, we haven't spent a whole lot of time talking about the other little bits and pieces when it comes to the design of this. you know, it is a very well presented product. It's got a beautiful metal bezel, nice and thin as well. The stand works really well. It's got a swivel mechanism. You can raise it, lower it, tilt it, all those things that you want in a high-end expensive monitor. There were a couple of little annoyances that I had when it came to just the usage long-term, things that you probably wouldn't notice, you know, in the first week or so that you were using it. But one thing I did notice is when I was sitting at my desk, it does have a little bit of wobble in the stand. You guys can probably see it there on camera now. So if I was kind of leaning on the desk, doing things like that, the screen would start to shake a little bit. Now, obviously that is something that's inevitable when you've got such a big display on a versatile mount like this. If you do have it mounted on a VESA mount for your sim rig, that's not an issue, so keep that in mind. Other little annoyance that I did have was the headphone jack is down underneath here as well. So I ended up having to use my phone on selfie mode to plug the headphones in every time I wanted to use them and bring them back here. But again, if you're using it in a single setup where you're not moving things around all the time, that's not really an issue. It was a little bit ugly having the headphone cable dangling down here. So there is that. But look, otherwise in terms of versatility, you know, you've got two HDMI 2.1 inputs. You've got a DisplayPort input as well. So there's no issues there. You've got optical audio. You've got DTS virtual surround with 11 virtual channels for headphones as well. So all the things that you would expect to find in a high-end monitor are all present here. And I think just overall, the experience with this thing is absolutely fantastic. Now, we should also talk about the curvature as well. At the 800 radius that we have here, I did find that it kind of pulled me in a little bit more, particularly when I was sitting at my desk playing things like first-person shooters. Obviously, it's not going to fill your complete peripheral vision, so it's not the same as having triple monitors. And I know that's something people ask a lot. Should I get a single ultra-wide display or triple displays? And I'd say it's not a replacement for triple displays, but having said that, there definitely is the advantage of simplicity here. You don't have to worry about setting up triple monitors and all the complexities and frustrations that come with that. It also does run a lot more easily than a triple monitor setup in terms of the resources necessary from your PC too. We did most of our testing today on a 11900K with a 3080 Ti, and it had absolutely no problem pumping well over 150 frames per second with the graphics set pretty high. When we were testing up to 240 hertz, we did have to crank things down a little bit, but you will find overall something like this will be easier to run on your PC than say triple 1440 monitors, just in terms of the system resources necessary to drive it. Now, while we're on the subject of resolution too, one thing that I was a little bit concerned about was the vertical resolution being a little bit vertically taller than a lot of the monitors I've used before, but still 1440p in terms of vertical resolution. I was worried it might look a little bit pixelated. Look, compared to the 4K monitor that I was running on my desktop earlier, I was running a 27-inch 4K, and that does look a little bit sharper just, you know, at face value. When you look straight at it, the pixels do look smaller, the dot pitch is obviously smaller, but I certainly didn't find that this looked fuzzy or anything like that. So yeah, I was used to this within a day or so. One thing that it did take me a little bit longer to get used to was the curvature just sitting at my desk though. When I was doing things like video editing, I did find that it kind of made me a little bit kind of tripped out just for the first week or so, but after that I adjusted to it, and now it actually looks weird going back to a flat display after this. But I'd say the 800 radius curve that we have here does work very well. Unfortunately, we do only have the one screen, so I wasn't able to test in a triple screen configuration, but I think that that would wrap around you quite nicely. It might be a little bit tight getting in and out of your rig, but if you're able to sit at that kind of 800 mil from the display range and have that wrap around you, it will end up being over 200 degrees, I believe, field of view that you would have. And the bezels, as you can see here, are nice and thin as well. So yeah, I think it would work quite nicely in the triple screen setup. I just can't personally vouch for it. So in conclusion, I've got to say I absolutely love this screen. It's an absolute joy to sit in front of every day for numerous hours. And yeah, it's definitely pulled me into wanting to play a lot more sort of first-person shooters and things like that as well, because it's really unlike anything that I've ever experienced before. So I would say if you have the funds for something like this and you're wondering whether it's worth it, absolutely you won't be disappointed with something like this. Whether it's value for money for you in your particular circumstances is obviously a subjective thing, but I think, you know, maybe if you already have a high refresh rate monitor and you're looking at, you know, maybe going from 144 hertz to 240 hertz, and, you know, that's the only reason for upgrading, then maybe it's not good value. But again, that's a subjective thing too, as you guys saw in this video. But if you're looking at upgrading from a cheaper LCD panel to OLED, and you're looking for something that's got super fast response time, super super high refresh rate and is going to tick all of those boxes, then absolutely, I have no reason at all not to recommend this. I think it's absolutely fantastic. So I really hope that today's video has helped you out, guys. If it has, please leave a thumbs up. Make sure you sub to the channel as well so you don't miss future videos. And if you do happen to own one of these or something similar, let us know what your experience has been like down below as well. As we were talking about, refresh rate is a very, very, very subjective thing. So I'd love to know from you guys, where do you feel like the sweet spot is for you in terms of the refresh rate? Where do you find that the return is simply diminishing? So thanks very much for watching, guys, and we will see you again very soon. Bye.